developing on opposite sides of the world have a strong bearing upon the subject of this morning, and I think should cause all serious persons to pause and consider. At this time in Israel, the Inquisitor General of the Nazi program of anti-Semitism is on trial, and the reports of this trial indicate a very serious problem, not bearing directly upon this issue, which is serious enough, but upon the circumstances by means of which the human mind, the human emotion, can be falsely directed to a degree dangerous to the survival of the human race. This month's issue of the Reader's Digest contains an article by Lowell Thomas on the present situation in Tibet. This situation is almost beyond human conception. And if Lowell Thomas's reports are correct, and he has secured them from persons escaping the country, this again is a blot on the name of humanity. Here a small nation, perhaps of 2 or 3 million persons, living a very quiet and secluded existence, and certainly not to be regarded as in any way dangerous to any type of political enterprise, being subjected to atrocities that transcend description. These atrocities are aimed at one essential point, namely the destruction of the religious life of these people. It is assumed, apparently, by the Communist Chinese that their control of a people depends upon the liquidation of the faith of that people, and if necessary, the entire generation of believers whose minds, souls they cannot control. The program further requires that all youth, young people, from infancy, are to be given a new conditioning, by means of which they will be taught to turn upon their own parents and kill them if necessary, in order to advance a certain political ideology. Now, these things are happening far away. They seem to be affecting small groups. We are deeply moved and sympathetic to the problems that here arise. But perhaps we do not understand or recognize the full machinery that is operating, not necessarily within a single political group, but in a social process, which is of the greatest concern to all of us. Our subject this morning deals with the hidden factors behind human behavior. And it seems to me that we have here rather dramatic laboratory examples of certain processes going on in the world continuously, which can spread and are spreading, and are even spreading among so-called democratic people to the ultimate hazard of our way of life. This situation is sufficiently real and serious for us to give it a great deal of thought. A large part of the world's problem today, unfortunately, originated with us. As we went quietly along our way, doing the things that seem to be opportunistic at the moment, we forgot the tremendous psychological influence that America has had upon the entire civilization of mankind. We have overlooked our responsibility as enlightened examples of a way of life. As a result of this, we have created around us groups of persons who envied what we had and were determined to acquire, in their turn, these privileges and advantages. With this envy, there was naturally a more careful consideration of our methods. ethics. And this consideration has led to a great deal of the trouble that now broods in the world. The tendency of the last generation has been the tremendous exploitation of the concept of economic progress. We have measured everything in terms of the physical status of the individual. We have sacrificed a great deal here to advance our economic development. And one of the principal things that we have sacrificed and are sacrificing is our ethics. And as our ethics go down, our ambitions and our selfishness correspondingly increase. And so today, in a small way, in a mild way, we are more or less moving into this block or pattern of people determined to advance physically, regardless of the cost in every other department of life. This determination, probably with us, has no single focal point. It is not the result of a definite indoctrination on the part of leadership. It is simply man's own natural selfishness gaining greater and greater control of his conduct. The individual has gradually weakened those parts of his character by which he was able to direct his efforts with a certain measure of cultural integrity. The loss of this integrity, in this nation particularly, bodes very ill for the future. It warns us definitely that consciously or unconsciously we are aligning ourselves with forces in society which we do not admire and whose actions we regard as reprehensible. So let us think for a moment of the policy which has been used in practically all of the totalitarian states of the world to accomplish what might be considered a general change in human character, to abruptly halt the ethical progress of man, and to substitute for it a kind of advancement based almost utterly upon self-interest. Now we will assume that Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, and Mao might all be moved by one basic concept which they regard as humanitarian. In other words, behind all of the totalitarian motives has been the concept of raising the standard of human living to the degree that people would be able to live well, to escape from ages of poverty or oppression, to break down the bonds and boundaries by means of which these persons or these groups were held in subjugation by other groups and nations. This situation also we see unfolding before us in the present African conflict. The only difficulty is this, and I believe it is a basic difficulty. If in the process of overcoming one evil, we must so indoctrinate the human mind that it loses sight of essential good, then if we are successful in raising the standards of these people to a way of life in which they are prosperous and internally and economically secure, we produce a group of people so indoctrinated that they are then a menace to themselves and each other. In order, for example, for one of these major powers that has been working along totalitarian lines to re-establish ethics and culture within their own group at some future time, they will be forced to turn upon themselves and exterminate perhaps 2 or 3 generations of their own people who have been so taught and so indoctrinated to non-cultural ideas that they cannot be free. These totalitarian powers will then have to do exactly the same thing within themselves that they are now doing to other people. You cannot culture a man after you have taught him that culture is a debasing and enervating thing. You cannot preach to him roughness and then suddenly expect him to become civilized. The final problem of these people will be that their policies and their efforts must ultimately undermine the very policies they are seeking to advance. This situation portends very little good for anyone concerned. Study of the psychology behind the problem is perhaps best expressed in the examples that we can see today in the group under present stress pattern. To begin with, a group or a leadership, which of course has become so complete that there is practically no escape from the boundaries of its influence. This group sets in motion a kind of doctrine. It sets up a concept of what is right and what is normal. It then proceeds along several lines to enforce the new concept which it has set in motion. One of the simplest ways always to enforce these ideas is to reach youth. To take the untrained and impressionable young person whose orientation is yet imperfect, and he has to depend largely upon example and circumstances for his right path, and begin to indoctrinate him violently with certain concepts. These concepts aim at the elimination of a previous social condition. Concepts in which the person is subjected to several kinds of pressure. One of these kinds of pressure which affects young people very quickly and very basically is ridicule. No young person wishes to be ridiculed. Life for the adolescent is difficult enough without the person finding himself in a completely non-social situation. If certain things that he does are ridiculed, he will ultimately stop doing it. His religion is ridiculed, and his associates ridicule him or his religious conduct. He is going to either submerge them or violently attempt to overcome them, especially where there is no religious force with any influence or authority to combat this indoctrination. Therefore, examine, ridicule, and the indoctrination through the reconstruction of a public school system. The constant pressure of fashion, a fashion set up to make humanitarianism unfashionable, to make dictatorialism fashionable. These pressures working upon the minds of the young must certainly have a profound and lasting effect. The only way in which this effect can be eliminated is again through the passing of long time and the rise of new generations. The whole world pattern has to change and make these very strict, non-ethical patterns no longer fashionable. Thus, through education, through example, through youth organization, through the general program of society itself, and indoctrination with basic concepts of venerated leaders, these means, one by one, applied to this continual increasing severity, gradually force the young person into a new attitude toward life. He has no orientation to protect him. He has no value to compensate for the values that are being forced upon him. He is made to feel that everything that he has previously known is wrong, and therefore that he must either depart from it or suffer the ridicule and penalty of the new society. This is one way in which this is accomplished. The other, and perhaps less obvious way, is the result of certain attitudes gradually corroding or corrupting a society, until one by one the individuals making up the group are brought into line with a common attitude. This may not be dominated by any dictatorial force, but it is dominated by a subtle code of punishment and reward. And as nearly all persons wish to be rewarded, and very few people wish to be punished, and very, very few people have will enough and strength of character enough to resist all forms of propaganda. The result is a gradual and insidious corruption of basic values. To a measure, this is the situation that threatens the West. Here we are not under any dictatorial policy that says that we have to do this or have to do that. We are, however, under a continuous pressure of profit. Certain things are profitable to do. Certain things are not profitable to do. And in the last century, those things which are most profitable are no longer most ethical. Those procedures by means of which we hope to advance our physical state are contrary to those codes and principles by means of which we develop material personal lives. Thus, we have come here gradually to a series of compromises. And these compromises are abetted by general pressures of our time. It is true that our academic materialism in the West is by no means of the violent nature which we find in dominated countries. It is true, however, that young people here are subjected to ridicule, to a certain not belongingness in our educational system if they try to preserve those ideas which they have received from their parents or from their religious traditions. So subject to a minor but continuous ridicule, many millions of young people are gradually becoming materialistic, becoming essentially atheistic, as an essential to the adjustment with the new order of life as it is developing in our heavily scientific and heavily industrial society. By degrees, then, we see the inevitable encroachment of a negative situation, a situation against which we have no well-established defense. And if this encroachment continues through the rising generation of young people, we may expect this generation to take control of world politics in the next 20 or 30 years as our mature leaders. And they are going to assume this position internally inadequate. They are going to assume this condition with profit as their primary consideration, rather than the basic advancement of the society to which they belong. The gradual crumbling of ethics everywhere in the world has made possible the atrocities which astonish us and bewilder us today. This situation is associated with what might be termed a hyper-intellectualism which we have developed in the West. We are not under the same motivation as dominated states of Europe and Asia. We are not struggling to maintain a standard of living in which we will survive. We have gone past this entirely. We are now struggling for a way of life which is largely the continuing gratification of our most selfish inclinations. We have security. We have had it for a long time. There was much we could accomplish in perfecting to bring gradually those less secure groups into full partnership in our security. But this is no longer the prominent motive in our thinking. We are thinking not only of security, we are thinking of the inevitable, continuous, and eternal expansion of our economics. We are thinking of the time when an individual, no matter what his status in life may be, whether he is employed or unemployed, whether he is intelligent or non-intelligent, will be able to have 3 cars in his garage with at least 1 swimming pool. This is now our idea of basic necessity. We are therefore reaching a point where we are selfish not for what we need, but merely for what we want. There is some excuse for an individual who is absolutely unable to support his family or to sustain himself with reasonable dignity for having a strong drive towards economic improvement. But at our point in the development of nations, this point is no longer the dominant one. We have become habitual accumulators. We are desperately desirous of continually advancing to a point that is unreasonable in any organized society. We cannot imagine that such a situation can be attained without the individual dedicating himself fully and completely to an economic program. If he does so, he will find, as we are finding, that this economic program becomes ever more complex and unethical. That the profit being the one and complete end and purpose, the means for attaining this end falls into opportunism. Anything that we can use as a means to gain our end becomes legitimate merely because we want that end. If we train 25 or 30 million young people in this concept in the next 10 years, we are going to face a very serious problem 20 years in the future. We are going to find people increasingly skillful and decreasingly honest. We are going to find that the rights of the individual are meaningless, and we are liable to turn into a pack of wolves, each one preying upon the other, each one looking for weakness in the other, and then turning on the members of his own pack and devouring them. It is not good to have this kind of thinking, but how are we going to evade or avoid the inevitable inclinations of people and the evidence which we see around us every day? There is a very deep need in this country and in other free peoples for the development of a strong ethical cultural program. A program in which the individual places the best part of himself as the leader of the rest. Unless the individual is able to maintain the vitality of his own conscience mechanisms, unless he is able to sense what is right and hold firmly to these principles which he knows to be essential, he will gradually fall under a series of opportunistic pressures from which he will have great difficulty in recovering. That these situations should arise in far places among underprivileged groups is understandable, but that we are not able to combat the situation more intelligently on our own level and in our own more advanced civilization seems very difficult to understand. It can only lead one basic thing, namely that the civilization of man is very precarious as far as his own nature is concerned. If the individual has pressed forward on the level of advancement far beyond the degree of his own internal integration. The conflict is not only present on the level of morals, but on the level of health. The average person today is sick simply because of conflict in his own life. He is sick because of the stress of factors pulling in opposite directions. Your totalitarian powers have attempted to ease this sickness or correct it by removing entirely the conscience pull. They have made simple obedience to the state the supreme virtue, and the end to be attained world domination or absolute economic prosperity. No other situations have really inspired these needs. Ethics has survived to become the tool of political purpose, and the individual finds that he is told that his instinct to venerate should now be directed entirely from the party or from the group of leaders that are dominating his way of life. These things give us a lot of thought in psychological situations because they are not only collective problems, but they are individual problems. In the life of the individual, we know from bitter example and proof that the kind of policy which dominates most of this materialistic totalitarianism is not effective in the life of the person. Now, some hold that it would be effective if all people acted that way. This, however, has not been demonstrated, and it is quite certain that where these groups have enforced their policies upon the people, the very enforcing group, the leaders, have then turned upon each other. And that for loss of ethics and for lack of ethics, even the unethical cannot survive. There has to be a kind of honor among thieves, or even thievery falls apart. And there has to be a certain sense of honor among criminals, or they betray each other. And this gradual loss of the entire basic principle of integrity now turns upon those responsible for its destruction. And we find that government in these countries is a mass of petty conspiracies, no individual safe from the very machinery he himself has created, no one able to escape the consequences of the powers placed in unscrupulous hands. Thus, every tyrant rests uneasy. He is not certain when his own tyranny will turn upon him. He cannot expect any friendship, any integrity, any affection, any regard, or any true respect from his own associates. When a situation reaches this degree, it tells us that it is sick, and any policy which brings on such a situation is basically unsound. Yet as we go merrily along our way, hoping each day the stocks will improve, or values go up, or wages decrease, we lose entire sight of the tremendous undermining that is going on in our public and private relationships. Now, I certainly do not advocate or believe that it is proper that a people should have a religious ethic forced upon them, that they should be required to comply with some theological code. But it is obvious that ethics as a principle is necessary, and that unless this principle is recovered, restored to value, is honored and respected, is taught with respect to the young, and is practiced with respect by the older, if these things do not happen, what we term civilization will fall apart. This falling apart process is visible today in many parts of the world. It is also very visible in the private lives of individual citizens. So we now pass from this larger theater of, we might say, laboratory testing into the smaller, untested areas of human behavior. We know, for example, that for many years we have had a general intellectual materialism, that this materialism affects those areas in which perhaps we have our greatest dependency. It affects our education, it even affects religion, it affects our higher professions, law and medicine, it is strongly affecting psychology, and it has more or less corrupted our entire Western philosophy. It is to be found throughout our economic structure in business and business relationships, where the tendency to desperation today is causing a continual fall of ethical attitudes. It permeates and practically nauseates us on the level of entertainment. It is present in our literature and in our art. It is attacking to a measure our music, but fortunately most of our unhappy situations arise among people who have not sufficient skill in the field to make a well-notated musical scale. They simply do not have the ability to compose music. We are therefore perhaps better off on a musical level than on any other. In these different situations, the individual is growing up, or he is growing older, and in an effort to survive, the individual is attempting to adjust. Adjustment is good and necessary, but adjustment should always be upward. Adjustment should be the individual striving to be better, and his adjustment should be rewarded in terms of his improvement. In other words, the individual who lives better should experience the advantages that come from a better way of life. He should not be placed in the unfortunate situation that the better he lives, the more miserable he is, and that all advantages lie in adjusting downward to a situation which is socially and individually unsafe. In other words, it is very much like a problem of a sickness being variously treated. The theory in illness, of course, is that the cause must be removed. And if a cause is present, it is up to the physician to recommend as wisely as he can, and it is up to the patient to observe carefully the regulations that are recommended. However, the end of the problem is not merely the obscuring of the ailment, Therefore, a medical adjustment to sickness, which simply consists in doping the patient, cannot be regarded as solving anything. The adjustment must be upward. The individual who wishes to feel better must live better. If he can be taught, the worse he lives, the better he'll feel, he will certainly be a very avid disciple of that particular code. But even though he is taught this, it does not operate in action. The consequences of compromise are always more compromises. And little by little, the individual falls into a difficulty from which he cannot extricate himself. So we have here every conceivable inducement for thought, while thought is possible, before processes reach such a complete impasse that there is no way out of the dilemma. Well, then we can begin to approach these motivations or causes behind what we do. The most basic cause, the most basic motivation known in man has always been fear. Unfortunately, fear is older than faith. Fear is deeper. And nearly every despot has played upon human fear. Every great enlightened leader has sought to build human faith. Thus the struggle between fear and faith is the same struggle as that between tyranny and wisdom. The search in the case of a tyrant is always for the vulnerable area he can control through fear. The great man, the truly enlightened person, can only control through faith. Faith must be always an upward conviction. It is a conviction of the reality of things better than they appear to be. It is the faith also that the individual, by his own efforts, can bring into existence a more commendable existence for himself and others. All true and essential progress is built upon faith. All false progress, leading ultimately to destruction, is built upon fear. In each human being, the elements of fear and faith are in continual conflict. Fear causes the person to seek to survive, placing the survival or the status quo above every other consideration. Fear is therefore the basis of compromise. The individual striving in every way possible to protect himself against that of which he is afraid will fall into the most dismal misdeeds in the effort to put off some evil day of reckoning. Fear, then, is an ever-approachable area in the human subconscious. Fear of loss, fear of ridicule, fear of isolation, fear of poverty, fear of sickness, fear of death, fear of the law. All of these fears have been used from time immemorial in the effort to control human beings. As long as man can be controlled by fear, one fool can rule another. As long as fear places all advantage on the level of force, power, or authority, the despot does not need to be particularly wise. He is not particularly wise, and in the course of time, almost always his despotism falls apart. But not until he has done a great deal of enduring and painful damage, and has left the world a heavy burden of debt to be passed on to future generations. The principal agency that we have against fear has been faith. And faith has been founded upon the religious convictions of man. The story of man's struggle to be better than himself is a story of religious effort. This does not mean that religions have always been right. This does not mean that many religions have not had within themselves a great element of fear. Some religions have used fear, and used it very unwisely, perhaps setting thereby the example which has brought back the karma of non-religious persecution. But fear in religion, even when it has been perverted, has largely been used in an effort to cause the individual to keep faith with something superior. It has taught him the importance of some kind of basic ideal. It has taught him to honor his Creator. It has taught him to keep the laws revealed to the religions and sacred books of the world. It has taught him honesty, a measure of honor and integrity, and has made him sense the importance of preserving the dignity of his own soul. These forces, regardless of their periodic corruption by pressure, these forces have basically been at the foundation of practically all human progress. Practically every leader to whom we now turn with respect in memory or in history was a person who had some kind of internal faith, some kind of conviction that there were rules and principles beyond man, and that these must be obeyed. It is such basic concept that has given us the roots of practically every culture, science, art, and philosophy that we know. This problem then comes down to the private life of the citizen. In his own nature, fear and faith are forever quarreling. Fear unfortunately, is not, for the most part, fear of lack of ethics. It is fear of need on some physical level. Thus we may say that the most dangerous types of fear have been those by which man has been influenced to renounce his own rights as a person and to become the slave or servant of some doctrine or belief, largely for the sake of expediency. If expediency takes its precedence over integrity, we will have the wrong kind of believing. It is a mistake, of course, to feel that faith itself cannot be corrupted. That is the problem that is being worked on now by most of the totalitarian powers. It is to shift man's faith from faith in principles to faith in leaders, and to faith in ideas which are themselves not sound. The individual is being taught a kind of faith which can ultimately bring him into a form of fanaticism, which is noted throughout most of the totalitarian states. But in our private life, each of us has this fear-free problem to confront. And each person must use such means as he possesses to keep his fears from dominating him to the degree that they cause a continual compromise in his character. If he does not achieve this, he is going to slowly slide into a total loss of ethics. Many means are used in society today to disillusion people. And disillusionment, while in itself perhaps only a correction of one error by another, is at this time rather a dangerous habit to indulge. This process of eternal criticism makes us particularly subject to the kind of thinking we want to avoid. I have noticed that most people who are hypercritical have a tendency to seek an escape to the lowering of their ethical standards. Hypercriticism causes us to have a revulsion or a rebellion against organized society. When we become hypercritical of our institutions, we very likely have no really sound recommendations to make. We are just unhappy. We are just a little frustrated by things. And much of this criticism, much of this general feeling is the result of very bad press, a constant agitation of the public mind through newspapers, television, radio, and other instruments of so-called communication, which are gradually becoming instruments of misinformation. breaking the patterns of his own values. Criticism becomes a negative tool then. And like nearly all negative instruments, it produces the unerring proof of its own fallacy. Criticism, when it becomes habitual, as it does with a great many persons, nearly always results in a lowering of the health pattern. Criticism destroys man's natural bodily functions. Criticism increases tension, leads to neurosis, and leads to sickness. An attitude which produces only a destructive result in the person who holds it cannot be regarded as a right attitude, regardless of how apparently justified it may be. I have never believed in this type of righteous criticism or righteous condemnation. The answer seems to be that behind all of these patterns, nature operates. And nature rewards those that keep its rules and punishes those that break its rules. Therefore, natural rules and natural law and order must be our final authority on most things. And nature does not reward negation. Nature does not hold out any real inducements or real promises to persons who take destructive attitudes regardless of cause. Nature does not reward a negative attitude which produces no common good. Thus we find that surrounding our central core of fear, which is our negative danger, there arises a group of classified fears. Each of these represents some form of anxiety, some effort to defend ourselves, some effort to protect something that is not essentially true or essentially right. And in our fears, we are constantly moved to justify ourselves for conduct that is not what it should be. So we create a great pattern of justifications. And these justifications finally summarize in one grand justification. Namely, that we are the victims of conditions. We are the victims of other people. We are the victims of the generation in which we live. We are the victims of the historical progress of mankind. We are the victims of policies we do not advocate, but which we do not have the courage to resist. These policies, however, are only catalysts, and we are reminded of the simple fact that if today there was no Russia and there was no China, there would probably be no reason to assume there'd be any more peace in the world than there is now. We would create some new catalyst. We will always have something, because this something becomes the grand excuse for our own failure to do that which is next, or that which is correctly necessary. Always we have to have a scapegoat to blame for the fact that we lack the personal courage to live well. We lack the personal incentives to live well. We are unable to gather up enough self-control to direct ourselves through even minor crises in our living. But in order that we shall always be right, even though we always are miserable, we have to create some form of excuse mechanism. So our justifications for our conduct become strongly supporting factors in the lowering of our ethical standards. We use our justifications to undermine our ethics. And we try to undermine our ethics by undermining the ethics of other people. This goes on and on and on, leading to from one compromise to another, until the whole pattern of society falls apart. Each person is surrounded by a series of pressures which induce him to react expediently but not wisely. He reacts according to his mood and not according to the morals of the situation. fully acquainted with the essential principles of society, we are willing to compromise these principles because at the moment we lack the desire or the strength to live them. I think we can find this in practically every phase of human relationships. It is distinguished in the breaking up of the American home. It is present in the general neglect and failure of proper supervision of children. It is present in our offices, among our friends, in our business associations, everywhere. It simply means that the individual has the individual feeling that he is powerless against the pressure of circumstances.